participants online. The last count we had was 60 plus, so a special welcome to those who are joining us online. It's a very great pleasure for me on behalf of the PCC to be convening this stakeholder engagement on the just transition financing mechanism. And we consider ways in which to find mechanisms to ensure that the just components of our transition, particularly in the just energy transition, but also more broadly as it relates to adaptation and resilience, to be developed so that finances can in fact flow to those projects and categories of local economic development programs which are at the moment not readily and voluntarily funded by your normal market mechanisms. So we see the work being done by ourselves as well as other partners in this just transition finance mechanism design process as being quite critical to inform both the capital and financial markets, but more importantly, the providers of tranches of capital all the way from grant to deeply concessional to concessional, and then finally commercial capital to be able to be made fit for purpose to fund those areas, as I said, of the just transition that the normal market mechanisms would find it very difficult at this point in their paradigm to fund. With those very few overarching comments, let me once again welcome everyone and indicate that today is going to be a sharing session. We would love comments and feedback, both at this session as well as in the next week from partners who might want to mull over and absorb what we present today. And we do want to finalize this section of our just transition financing project work in the next week or two. With those words of welcome, we also thought it an opportune moment and fit to ask the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan Project Management Unit, which is located in the Presidency, to be given an opportunity to present to us their thoughts as they develop the implementation plan for the JET IP. And so before we proceed with the agenda as distributed to colleagues, let me call on Joanne Yawich, the head of the JET IP PMU in the Presidency, to explain and share with us the work that they are busy doing and some of the perspectives that they have as they prepare the JET IP investment plan. Joanne.
Thank you very much, Deepak, and thanks to the PCC for this opportunity. I think that the PCC has played a critical role in the development of the JET IP implementation plan and JET IP investment plan, and going forward into its implementation. I think that there is a similarly important role for the PCC. And as I want to give you an update of the work that we're doing, and as I do that, you'll see how important the work is that the PCC is doing in terms of informing and influencing the way forward. Okay, so you will all remember that the investment plan was handed over to government in November last year. It was handed by the president to the PCC with a request to consult on it. That consultation took place earlier on this year. There is a very comprehensive report out, and quite a lot of the work that we have been doing over the last while has really been to look at the PCC's recommendations and to say how, going forward into implementation, do we take account of the issues and the concerns that were raised by the PCC. And as we move into the implementation plan, we are commissioning and starting to do particular pieces of work that address those recommendations. So, for example, we are doing further work on skills. I think that one of the key issues that was raised was a concern that the skills part of the plan is quite seriously inadequate. We are doing another piece of work that will hopefully result in a much more robust approach to skills in the investment plan. We are doing further work on municipalities, quite a big piece of work of municipalities. And that really responds to the issues around distribution, but also to the issues around how we ensure that we address both energy poverty and ensure that in renewables, in rolling out a greater degree of renewables in our energy mix, we ensure that in particular the poor there are mechanisms put in place to make it feasible for poor people to be able to benefit from that as well. So there's a lot of work happening around municipalities as well. One of the big criticisms from I think across the board was around the level of grant in the package. So we have worked in the first half of this year with quite a wide range of philanthropies and countries and multilateral agencies to try and up the level of grant in the package. And that has resulted in some significant new allocations that are being programmed at the moment or that have been allocated but are still in the process of work being done on the detail of how they will be used, including from the EU, from Germany, some funds from the US, but also a range of other countries coming into the mix and other philanthropies. So I think that we're starting to get somewhere in relation to the grant package. I think that we are really interested in the outcome of this work and this consultation to inform the way and to be able to support the building of a framework that ensures that there is an equitable distribution, in particular of grant finance, but other finance as well, including for SMMEs and for the economic diversification. And what we have been looking at is a way to get greater coordination and alignment by donors of the work that they're doing and the funding that they're allocating in relation to the kinds of national frameworks and approaches that we would encourage. And one of the things that we are looking at is how we can build the kinds of mechanisms that really do allow from an on-the-ground up development of projects in order that that grant finance is being deployed in ways that really do serve the needs of communities and workers. So we're looking at that as well. On the issue of the loan finance, I think that we are dealing with some some significant challenges. Fundamentally, the assumptions that were made in the development of the investment plan and the situation that we're sitting with today in relation in particular to the power, to the electricity, to the situation in the country with regard to electricity has changed. So the Eskom debt moratorium in particular has meant that a lot of what is in that investment plan doesn't hold. I think there were assumptions made around Eskom being able to take loans and around sovereign guarantees being issued, which are not possible at the moment, not for the next 3 years. And so in relation to that, we've been working with National Treasury and others on looking at different solutions for the finance that we want to go into transmission and into the repurposing, repowering, and decommissioning of power stations. And lastly, we are waiting for the outcome of work that National Treasury is doing to assess the state of our coal fleet in order to be able to look at whether the current decommissioning schedule needs revision, given the country's energy security crisis. In relation to timelines and the implementation plan, we are hoping the implementation plan in many respects is going to be a roadmap on its own, a more detailed roadmap of what needs to happen in order that those investments and the funds are deployed. In some cases, there's going to be further work to be done. And so I think that there's a fair extent to which what we're going to put out is going to be the delineation of the work that needs to happen going forward and an approach to being able to do that. We are going to be working over the next 2 or 3 months to be able to get a draft of that implementation plan out. We are going to be holding a set of subject-related workshops. We would certainly ensure that all of the PCC commissioners are able to join those workshops, so we'll make it known when they are. And we will then want to engage on how we haven't yet worked out on what form the consultation on this plan will take place, but I think it's going to be a much more as we go along engagement with stakeholders than we were able to do with the development of the investment plan itself. So I think, Deepak, that is just a short update. And, you know, really thank you very much for this platform. And we hope that we can continue to both benefit from the work that you are doing, because there is no point in reinventing wheels or duplicating what is being done. But also, I think that the PCC constituency is a really critical one in terms of you all knowing where we are at and what the work is that is currently underway. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Joanne. And to quickly add on, we have agreed with the JET IPPMU that as they develop the implementation plan, not only will we feed content from our perspective as the PCC after stakeholder consultations into that investment plan, but that we will also be facilitating the stakeholder engagements and the perspectives directly to the PMU as the PCC convenes stakeholder engagements on various subject matters going forward. It's a great pleasure, before I forget, to also have Commissioner Mbodi in the audience. Welcome, Commissioner Mbodi. The keynote address giving us the contours and the importance of why specific measures need to be undertaken to ensure that all aspects of the just transition get financed, all the way from livelihood stimulation through to ameliorating the negative impacts that might be felt by some communities and some spatial environments as the just transition unfolds, but just as importantly, to ensure that we promote SMME and social ownership in the process of unfolding the just transition. It's a great pleasure to invite Commissioner Zama Kanyile to give a keynote address this morning before we get into the project details. Commissioner.
Thank you, Deepak, and good morning to all in attendance physically and those who've joined us online. I trust I'm audible, so I'll look for a signal if I should fade. So thank you. My name is Zama Kanyile. I am a commissioner in the Presidential Climate Commission, but my 9 to 5 is being a divisional executive at the National Empowerment Fund, where I'm tasked with overseeing our venture capital and corporate fund activities, as well as our Women Empowerment Fund. So the PCC is a multi-stakeholder body that was established by the President of South Africa to advise on the country's climate change response and to find pathways to a low-carbon, climate-resilient economy and society. And the PCC facilitates these dialogues between social partners on these issues, defining the type of society that we want to achieve and detailing those pathways on how to get there. Several barriers to scaling up finance for a just transition have been identified within the domestic financial sector. And in this context, the work on the climate dimension of transition is more advanced than that on the social side, which reflects the status quo that one observes internationally. The nascent state of policy and evidence-based development complicates the creation of a conceptual framework for financing a just transition. And the JTFM framework identified that these barriers that are most pertinent to the mobilization of transition finance fall into three broad categories, being the policy and regulatory issues, misaligned capital allocation, and market gaps. As we all know, a thriving, robust SME sector is critical to economic growth, to labor absorption, and also to attending to the triple threat that South Africa faces of inequality, poverty, and unemployment. So it goes without saying that a substantial growth in SMEs will be required to achieve a just transition, to drive new green economic opportunities, and to accommodate those workers that may be displaced from the declining brown sectors. While some SMEs will be engaged in technological innovation, others with more traditional business models may have low growth potential, but they actually offer greater labor intensity, which reduces unemployment. But despite SMEs being the growth engine of the economy, SMEs still struggle to access finance. And when they do, they are often unable to afford the interest rates charged. Funding costs are especially high for the informal sector, given the avenues that they can explore to access this funding. SMEs are typically also thin profit businesses, which means that in order to be successful, they have to run a lean cost structure. This lean cost structure then often leaves very little room for loan affordability. Government plays a critical role in overcoming these barriers to a just transition. The volume of financing for smaller businesses and projects will need to be scaled up several orders of magnitude to support meaningful growth in the sector and to ensure a just transition. And one of these observed challenges within just transition finance is the lack of private sector funding. And in an ideal state, government should create an enabling environment that aids private sector participation and investment. Within the South African context, our energy crisis has compounded onto our climate change considerations and has precipitated the speeding up of our energy transition. One of the acts to mitigate against these is the recently launched Energy One-Stop Shop that was announced by Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition, Minister Ibrahim Patel. And this Energy One-Stop Shop is expected to streamline the regulatory processes for private investment in electricity generation, and it'll facilitate the pre-investment screening for all energy projects. So almost like a project preparation assistance, and fast-track the approval of energy applications. So this is part of government's wider efforts to refocus resources and increase the supply of energy available to the grid, and also stimulating renewable energy. One of the aims of the Energy Resilience Fund is to focus on those businesses that are placed in townships, that are placed in rural areas, and to also support the localization of inputs. Within the ambit of this Energy Resilience Fund is the EDF's Alternate Energy Fund, which provides concessionary funding specifically for solar-powered energy solutions as a starting point, which has a fixed interest rate of up to 2%. And this is highly concessionary when compared to traditional funding sources that we see in the space. It also is accompanied with a moratorium or payment holiday that can be up to 12 months, providing the much needed relief, and a repayment period of 84 months. And it's these objectives of this concessional funding is that these government initiatives can be blended with commercial terms offered by the private sector, and to make the projects more affordable, especially on an MME level. Credit enhancements measures such as these are going to be crucial in attracting private investments for just transition projects. By providing financial guarantees or credit support, governments and development finance institutions can improve creditworthiness of just transition initiatives, which therefore reduces the risk that private investors and commercial lenders may see. De-risking capital is also required in diversifying financial resources and mobilizing private and public funding to accelerate the adoption of transition technologies. Private and public partnerships can be formed to share the financial burden and create innovative financial solutions. And such approaches not only reduce the exposure of individual exposure, but the exposure of individual investors, but also attract a wider pool of capital and broaden the institutional know-how in carrying out the due diligence to support the transition towards a decarbonized economy for all. As a DFI, one of our initial observations and challenges experienced in rolling out of our energy transition funding in the SME space is the lower than expected take-up, which could be indicative that in some instances, energy transition wasn't part of the SME's immediate or short-term strategy, which means that the budget allocations and the requisite planning hasn't taken place. And this can result to limited or no affordability, even with the concessional terms that are offered. So this has highlighted to us in this space that there is a need for greater grants or conditional non-repayable funding in the space. Effectively addressing these transition financing barriers will require comprehensive investigations of financial needs associated with the transition. It will also require constructive engagement with key financial stakeholders, both public and private, and on delivering against the needs and aligning the institutional arrangements in the financial sector. Gaining access to additional affordable global capital could also serve as a national incentive for the policy and business changes that need to take place. In this just energy transition, social ownership of projects that require grant and capacity building capital are going to be essential for empowering low-income communities and ensuring equitable access to clean and sustainable energy sources. These projects represent an alternate approach to not just the energy, but economic development where community members collectively own and govern the initiatives leading to broader socioeconomic benefits. New value chains and local economic activities must be created to address the vacuum left by the decarbonization of our energy system and other industries, most importantly at a community level. By empowering low-income communities, providing equitable access to energy, fostering economic development, and addressing environmental justice, these projects contribute to a fair and inclusive transition towards a more sustainable and resilient future for all. Thank you. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Kanyile. That was a very interesting and elaborative explanation of the financial ecosystem, the challenges in bringing different types of providers of capital, as well as therefore different types of capital together to enable key elements of the just transition. Commissioner Kanyile, your focus as well on SMMEs is well taken. We all understand that that is the place where enterprise development, business development, job creation, and further distributing the participation in the economy actually lies. Your reference to SARM, which was released about a week and a half ago, which is still open the way I understand it, at least to the PCC for comments, is well taken because it speaks directly to the green transition and the domestic South African opportunities that lie within the rollout of our just energy transition. I also needed to say that this work being done by the PCC on the just transition financing mechanism is really related to the broader spectrum of projects that we have in our portfolio of projects. It is not a standalone. And it has been a while since we, in trying to understand the climate finance landscape in general, trying to understand the ecosystem and the current paradigm within which investors, lenders, and providers of capital operate, that we see the need to have a very specific approach, where necessary intervention, and again, where necessary, an almost recommendatory and advocacy-based approach to ensuring that partners in the provision of capital who would not normally come together are in fact enticed, sometimes cajoled, and certainly encouraged to find creative ways in which we can blend as well as stack appropriate types of capital into fitness for purpose to meet the especially just elements of the just transition. I want to now call on Kwezikazi Windful, the project finance and municipal manager, project and municipal finance manager in the climate finance team of the PCC, to give us the broad contours of this JTFM project before we go with the project team into the details of the project's work. Kwezi?
Thank you, Deepak, and good morning to everyone. My name is Kwezi Windful, and I am the Municipal and Project Finance Manager with the PCC Secretariat. I work in the Climate Finance and Innovation Unit. So the Climate Finance and Innovation Unit, it plays a crucial role and a cross-cutting role in supporting the other pathways of mitigation, adaptation, and resilience within the PCC Secretariat. And our aim is to create strategies to unlock greater access to finance for a low carbon and climate resilient economy. We have a clearly defined role, and this role is underpinned by our purpose to firstly monitor and evaluate capital flows. This is where our climate finance landscape mapping project sits under. And then to mobilize climate finance, and that's where the JTFM project sits under. We are also responsible for enabling the flow of funds, and this is where we have our financial sector dialogues, our DFI CEOs forum, as well as our energy and water pathways projects. And then lastly, our aim is to identify the technology and innovation challenges and opportunities that lie within the just energy transition. South Africa's Just Transition Framework, the JTF, was developed in 2022 by the Presidential Climate Commission and was adopted by the Cabinet in August of 2022. And it has at its core a focus on quality of life for all South Africans. It supports the country's broader efforts to redesign the economy to enable a deep, a just, and transformational shift to the benefit of all citizens. However, the financing of the country's energy transition requires an enormous amount of funding, and it is also quite likely to be that some types of projects and initiatives cannot be funded for various reasons by the public sector, the private sector, and philanthropies. And sometimes, even a combination of these instruments, at least not in the existing or conventional structures that already exist within the market, can be of service to these projects. So under the mobilization of climate finance, we have successfully completed and published 2 papers, which is the financing of a just transition, as well as the just transition financing mechanism paper, with the aim to understand the climate finance environment, and more specifically in the aspect of the just transition, as well as to ensure that as just transition projects start to get developed and go into the market, there are clearly defined mechanisms out there to fund them. To address the scale and the urgency of the just transition imperative, the JTFM is being developed by the PCC to supplement public and private financing. Other countries such as the EU and Canada and a growing number of other countries have set up similar mechanisms, having noted the same constraints that we have identified domestically. Some of these constraints are that the quantum of capital that is required over a short period of time, our need to address the impacts of stranded assets, job losses, and shrinking economic activity at a regional and community level. This cannot be fully accommodated by the fiscus due to the static revenue and servicing heavy indebtedness. The non-market nature of a large portion of just transition funding requirements. The priority investments here include upgrading of skills, social safety nets, and capacity building to improve the project development capacity of local governments and SMMEs. Marginal economics of high impact projects. Research has shown that transition economics point to the inability of many socially impactful projects and initiatives to actually reach or achieve bankability. This then rules them out completely from accessing finance from commercial sources. Capital market imperfections. So imperfect information and unwillingness to accept high and uncertain credit risk can result in frequent credit rationing, hampering the adjustment of capital markets to changing circumstances. Within this context, the JTFM project, therefore, seeks to map a credible and realistic space within which to operate, exploring ways in which different sources of funding can combine to create opportunities for financing projects that promote the just elements of the just transition. An unprecedented quantum and creative mix of funding from the entire spectrum of capital sources will need to be mobilized, and the financing of the social or just elements of the transition. And given how new and complex we foresee this to be, it has required us to research and propose how the country might operationalize structures or an ecosystem that will support the financing of these just elements. The ecosystem will explore the potential of funding projects which might not meet the risk, scale, and return expectations of commercial investors and lenders by looking to blend available capital from the fiscus, philanthropies, and other sources of deeply concessional finance. Our proposed solutions will consider, amongst other aspects, the ideal mix of scarce grant resources, limited fiscal capacity, and other private sector development funding. The JTFM is also developing an assessment mechanism and framework to determine which projects can actually be classified as just transition projects for the purposes of potentially qualifying for just transition and climate finance, which my colleagues, I think, will speak to more in depth as they dive deeper into the analytical governance and institutional elements of the JTFM. In closing, we foresee the JTFM as a policy-aligned national platform, which will be key in mobilizing additional capital for a just transition and the coordination of funding from various sources that align allocation with the JET framework and other policy priorities. This way, we as the PCC believe that the government and existing financial institutions, both private and public, can scale up and optimize their impact of their investments to ensure that the justice element of the transition is not forgotten and that truly no one gets left behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Kwezi. Those 2 addresses were intended to locate the JTFM in its context, both within the work areas of the PCC, but just as importantly, to begin to lay the principle and strategic frame within which a just transition financing mechanism could be maximally developed to interact with the existing status quo while taking a view into the future with respect to some of the transformative work that also needs to happen. We're now going to get into some of the meat of the project's analysis, evaluative work, as well as in the second part of the session into some detail with respect to assessment mechanism by way of determining whether in fact projects can be assessed to be just transition finance projects or not. Before we get into that very detailed section, I'd like to call on Roy, who leads the project team in this work, and he will sketch for us the inception phases as well as the boundary areas of the project, and then take us through some of the analytical work that the project team has done. Roy.
Thank you very much, Deepak, and good morning to, just still morning, good morning to everyone. It's great to be here. Great to give feedback on this project. My name is Roy. I was previously at the National Treasury, and I feel now I work for the President, and the Presidency, so perhaps I've been upgraded. So thank you very much. I'm going to give a quick sketch of where we are on the project. I think as the speakers have highlighted, it's very much a consultation session. This is an opportunity for us to get input from everyone on where we are with the project and what we're thinking at the moment, and really part of a long-run consultation process, which the PCC is managing. So I'm going to quickly sketch where we are in the project, some of our thinking, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the tagging framework. We've already had a focus group session with, I think, some people on the tagging framework, and we'll just go through that quite quickly. Feel free to post questions in the chat, and I'll either deal with them as we go along, or perhaps at the end we can have a Q&A session for the two sections. I'm going to talk to the progress to date on, we have a workstream 1, which deals with some of the institutional arrangement issues and deals with some of the problem statement. Workstream 2 relates specifically to the institutional proposals that we are thinking about in terms of how the JTFM could function quite effectively. And then the other part, which we've done before, but we're also going to do again for this audience, is on the tagging framework, particularly around background methodology and criteria, and then we'll have some Q&A. So just to give some context on the JTFM, I think you should never ask an economist to do research. And I'll talk a little bit about all the things we've highlighted. This is where we are in the project. And as I said, we're very much in the consultation phase at the moment. There's very much an opportunity for us to get inputs from people. So we do welcome any inputs that we have from you. Right, so never ask an economist to get involved in a project. We've had some great discussions with Chippy about what is the problem statement, what are we trying to achieve with this project. So we'll talk a little bit about the problem statement, which is the bottlenecks between the flow of funds and the just transition projects. I'll talk a little bit about that. Then we'll talk about the market failures, specifically information asymmetry, coordination failures, transition costs, and diverse investment horizons. And then what that means, so if you set up those problems, what that means for how we can think about a mechanism that can go about to improve the flow of funds from those with financing to those who want to finance projects, or who need projects to be financed. So on the other side. And then, like I said, we'll talk about some of the matchmaking and then some of the tagging framework. I think we're all aware, and the report goes into quite a lot of detail on this, around the fact that there are a number of countries that have implemented just transition financing mechanisms. These mechanisms act as nodes, and so they connect funders and projects, and that's quite important across the entire just transition financing ecosystem. And so they operate a little bit as matchmaking platforms. Now, I've got quite a young project team who are all, most of them are here today, and they tell me about these matchmaking platforms that they use to meet people. In some ways, we have thought about this as a matchmaking platform for how do we bring people who have just transition financing, particularly concessional financing, together with people and project owners who would like projects to be funded. So how do we think about that as a problem? And these are typically, in most of the international experience, relatively centralized institutions. They play a strong coordination role. They integrate, they have high levels of political support, which I think in our case is great that we have such strong political support from the president and the presidency and the PCC. There's policy alignment, so they align to the policy objectives of what they're trying to achieve. And then they have, all of them around the world have got, because of this tension between the centralization and the fact that often these projects are delivered at a very local level, there is this challenge of a local responsiveness. And they've also thought through ways in which they can deal with that problem. So in short, we talk a little bit about how we think about this matchmaking platform, but we envisage a matchmaking platform to connect funders and project sponsors in the whole ecosystem. We suggest it needs to be centralized in some way. We'll talk a little bit later about what we think the most effective way of centralizing it would be. And it's a key mechanism to bridge the funding gap between the just transition financing mechanism. So the things it needs to achieve are to reduce uncertainty, signal alignment with the just transition framework, and mobilizing funding for the just transition failure. I've spoken a little bit about this, but this is really at the heart of the problem statement. So what are the bottlenecks that hinder the financing in the just transition ecosystem? As I've said, very much an information asymmetry is one of the problems. So we have people with significant concessional financing, typically pension funds, etc., and they are often might be a DFI or KfW or GIZ. Not necessarily aware of what the different set of possible projects are in South Africa they could fund. So they have this information asymmetry problem, is they don't necessarily know all the details of what could be funded. Similarly, at a project level, at a very local level, unclear how to get in contact with just transitional funding. So two sides have an information asymmetry problem. And as we know from economics, it's difficult. What you need to do in your central, or how you deal with this is in your centralized system, is you create a mechanism to provide information to parties. And in many ways, the tagging framework that is part of this project tries to deal with that. And in some ways, the tagging framework provides the information issue. Then there's coordination failures. So these are typically very large and complex projects. Obviously, I think PCC stands out internationally as one of the really good ways of dealing with this coordination problem, to coordinate between all the different stakeholders. There are transition costs, and then there are diverse investment horizons. So as we know, typically funders want relatively short or medium-term returns, but on the other hand, the sorts of projects that we need to finance from a climate change and transition perspective are often very long-term investment, have very long-term investment horizons. So you have to think very carefully about how you match this diverse investment horizons problem between funders and projects. And I've spoken about what this links to the international experience. So that sets up the problem statement, the idea that generally a good idea is to, from the international literature, thinking through all these different issues, is to set up some sort of centralized mechanism which can work to deal with these issues. And so workstream 2 of the project deals with what is the nature and type of this type of institution. How would that look in South Africa? What are the sort of South African contexts that we need to take into account? We looked at a little bit of institutional design, so the institutional character and the legal form of the JTFM, the governance framework, so what would the governance platforms look like? Could they look like? How would this sort of platform be governed? How would we think about the different structures to make sure that we keep alignment with the PFMA and all of the constitutional requirements, etc.? And then it's operational processes. So how does this financing mechanism, what are the sorts of things that it does on a day-to-day basis? How does it operate? What are the processes it does, etc.? And this really, I think, brings together it in a very nice picture in terms of this need for the JTFM with an overarching governance body of some description. You have potential just transition funders on this side, projects that need to be funded on that side, and then what we call JTFM elements. And if this mechanism works, what it will do is bring together the funders and the projects through what we call elements, and I'll explain what we mean in elements in a moment, and that will then match funds to projects. It's really quite a simple way of trying to explain what we think a just transition financing mechanism can try and achieve. Now to explain what we've defined as elements, it's a bit of a strange term for what we mean, but I think it makes a lot of sense to people that have worked a lot in this area. And that is what we refer to as the different elements being projects that can be funded completely without any sort of government intervention. So these are typically a far right-hand side, I would say, projects that have got commercial viability. Typically, the mechanism may not get involved in those sorts of projects. And the reason why the mechanism may not get involved is because these projects may be able to find their own financing. However, the JTFM can play a role in terms of providing information on these projects. On the very left-hand side are projects that have got no commercial viability at all, probably need some sort of grant funding. So they need sort of a fiscal transfer, or they need philanthropic money, or some kind of a grant funding. So they've got no commercial viability. And then somewhere in between are projects that may need some support to get to a version of commercial viability. So they may need perhaps some concessional financing, or they may need a portion of grant financing, or a portion of fiscal support. We use this very sometimes overused word for projects like that, and we refer to that as blended financing. It's a very strange word, but it's become quite a useful way of thinking about projects that need a combination of different types of financing, combination of concessional financing and some commercial financing. These are typically very difficult to put together because you have different stakeholders. So you will have, for example, people with that word philanthropic, put together with commercial finances, put together perhaps with concessional financing. You have to create a package of different financiers, and that's very difficult. And has over the years, we've always spoken about this, but has been quite difficult to deliver. Okay, so then with that in mind, we did some thinking about what are the potential institutional mechanisms or legal frameworks that you might be able to use to deliver such a JTFM. Obviously, many people think that, and perhaps the best solution is a fully public sector entity created within the PFMA. So we create a sort of a PFMA entity. We list it in terms of either Schedule 2 or Schedule 3 in terms of the PFMA. And we create this JTFM PFMA entity. Anyone who has been involved in any one of these knows that we're talking about years and years of work. Unclear that this is what we need right now. But just to flag, that is something that people have obviously highlighted, something that could be done, but is a very long and complex process. Don't want to give away the game quite yet, but yes. We can obviously create an entity in terms of the Public Service Act. So there are a number of examples. Some of them work reasonably well. The Heightened Infrastructure Financing Agency, which has had some successes, is created in terms of the Public Services Act as a government component in the Gauteng provincial administration. It certainly is something that we investigated in quite a lot of detail. It could be an entity that's incubated with an existing PFMA entity, like, for example, the DBSA. We did explore that as an option. There are advantages and disadvantages to that. Obviously, the DBSA is a PFMA entity already. It has an internal governance framework. It does not necessarily has to be DBSA. Could we investigate a number of different options under this? There could also be, and many people did highlight this during our consultations, a jointly owned ownership shared between the private and the public sectors in some way. There are some entities that have followed this route. There was obviously the Solidarity Fund, which was set up very, very quickly during COVID, a really interesting example. And then there's obviously the option of a fully private entity. So a fully private entity has a lot of major advantages, but there are a lot of governance issues. It gets quite complicated, the relationship between the government and the state. But it is something that we did do some analysis on and thought around. Overall, our recommendation is that probably at this stage, it is best to incubate it with an existing entity. And we are thinking at this stage, and we will continue with some consultations on this and have engagements, particularly again with the DBSA. But at this stage of the project, we do think that that it may be best to, if you go through this list of different options, and the report goes into quite a lot of detail about all the different advantages and disadvantages of each of the structures, is that for a variety of reasons, we do recommend at this stage that the PCC appoint the DBSA to manage the JTFM. This, as many of you know, we have got, and we've some excellent reports done on this in terms of the relationship with DFFE and the DBSA and lessons, and we've had a lot of engagement with the DBSA on the lessons that they've learned about the relationship, particularly some of the issues early on, as we know that it wasn't necessarily all that successful, but it has over time improved, and particularly around some of the governance arrangements, the MOA, the reporting arrangements. There are some issues around accounting treatment, particularly when you have state money, that obviously some of these things are capitalized from a treasury allocation. And that has, for a variety of reasons, created accounting issues, but they have now sorted through all of those things. But it is not necessarily impossible to imagine that even the JTFM could, I mean, I no longer at the Treasury, so I can't promise anything at all, but that there's no reason necessarily that that there can be a fiscal. I see the Treasury people in the room are smiling. There's no reason necessarily the JTFM could not necessarily be provided with some sort of fiscal injection, similar to how the Green Fund works through that process. And then obviously there's a lot of relationships between the Green Climate Fund and the Climate Finance Facility, which we've also used as a very good template for understanding a lot of the governance issues, particularly around the sort of contracts that need to be drawn up. Then in terms of thinking about the role and the composition of governance bodies, obviously you need some sort of governance body that is responsible for overseeing the JTFM operations, the decision-making and the strategic directions, things like meetings, decision-making, conflict resolution, protocol and membership changes. And I think this is one of the advantages of using an entity like the DBSA, is that you can, and this is what we're going to do as part of the next phases of the project after these consultations, is look at how various stakeholders could be represented on these oversight committees, so that there is a strong feeling of ownership and community voice in the rollout of the JTFM. The DBSA has quite a lot of experience in stakeholder management along these lines, but it could comprise of various stakeholders, government entities, obviously the PCC playing a very, very important role, financial institutions, the private sector, and even civil society. This is more like an oversight. It doesn't necessarily mean that there is day-to-day decision-making around the actual allocation of funds, because I think you have to think very carefully from a governance perspective in terms of separating out the day-to-day actual allocation and matching from the role of oversight and overseeing. But obviously the PCC, as it's set up and conceptualized, is very much sort of the coordinator and driver of many of these things. Strategic direction, policy development, oversight, and particularly things like risk management. The PFMA does require quite an extensive amount of reporting, et cetera, which DBSA has quite a lot of experience over many years to do. And you have to think through all the different risks that could arise from a structure like this. And so we think through different functions that the governance role should have. It has an advisory role, which is to give strategic guidance. It has a very important role in terms of providing voice and representation. It provides monitoring and evaluation, something I haven't really spoken about. But what you have to think about very clearly is once you have made these matches and once you have started financing projects, is to what extent you have an ongoing monitoring and evaluation process to make sure that the funds are used and used appropriately. And then obviously stakeholder engagement, like I said, very, very important, particularly with something that is as high profile as this. And then to facilitate good governance, so ensure that the governance body complies with relevant legislation, audits, and reviews. And this is just a map of the stakeholders that I think would be quite important for the project. And then we go into a lot of detail about the sort of different stages, quite a lot of detail in the report about the life cycle of the different stages. So this is now talking a little bit more to the operating model. There are a lot of international experiences of operating models of mechanisms like this, and we've drawn on those international experiences. Setting institutional policy, project generation, strategy, screening, matching, and M&E. I think the Commissioner spoke about a very important component of it, and I know this has come up in a lot of questions, which is this idea of the need to actually find the project. So, the experience has been that project preparation is a very important thing. Interestingly, sometimes the language that is used internationally is project generation, which suggests that the financing mechanism also has a role in terms of finding projects and helping support them to a point where they could be matched. And a lot of the international experience is along those lines, because obviously these are often community projects, don't necessarily have the capacity or actually the money to prepare themselves to get funded. And so you get caught in this weird little trap. This is sort of what Workstream 2 will deal with, and we go into a bit of detail about the roles and responsibilities, etc. You can't see the heading of the slide, but this is really where we're going next. But we're very much in the consultation phase here, so we're very open to where we are in the project and where we think we're going. But if this is sort of the direction of travel that people are comfortable with, then we will start developing local skills and capacity requirements of the JTFM. Obviously, they need quite strong financing and technical skills, but also understanding the transition, etc. High-level job requirements and skills matrix of all categories. And then this will be to take the form of a series of written documents. We were working with HR specialists on that part. I'm going to pause there because this is the first part of the thing, which is the institutional structure. We will take questions at this point, if that's helpful, Deepak, and then we can perhaps talk about tagging.
Thank you, Roy. Do you want to stay here at the podium?
I can stay here. Yeah.
Good. And I'm assuming that you're monitoring both the Q&A and the chat online. We're now opening up for questions. Thank you very much. Questions and comments. Thank you very much, Roy, for sharing with us what are the emerging perspectives out of the project as it relates to ecosystem, as it relates to some of the governance issues, and then, of course, some of the financial institutional issues that one needs to consider and address as we look at what is the best fit for purpose set of mechanisms that would allow us to mobilize, aggregate, blend, and then deploy capital towards just transition projects. We do want to emphasize that we are in the throes of the project planning period, and therefore thought it prudent and correct to share some of these emerging perspectives with the audience, and in particular various stakeholder groups in the country, so that we can get feedback. There are some very specific recommendations, as you can see, which are beginning to emerge, and they are not necessarily cast in concrete. And so if you have any really serious bones of contention with respect to any of the things that Roy has presented as those emerging views, please feel free as well to throw some stones, but don't break any glass. So with those words, I'm going to firstly ask Roy to field some of the comments as well as Q&A in the chat, maybe 3 or 4 of them, and then I'll also open up the room for questions and comments. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Deepak. Let me see if I can get myself, see all the questions. Yeah, I think there were some questions early on. I'm sure, I don't know if anyone can see the questions on your side, but the first question was, how does the JTFM differentiate between deeply concessional and concessional finance? I think that was, sorry, I think we were on the other one, the Q&A. Let me deal with these quickly, and then I'll deal with those. Yeah, I mean, as we sort of highlighted, our emerging thinking is that you do need an institutional structure you do need a framework within which this could be done. So you need to appoint the appropriate skills to ensure that you can engage with different funders. And so the part of the design is these different elements. There's a question about how we would do energy poverty funding, and I think I'm going to leave that to the tagging discussion. And then how does financing the net zero meet the needs of the changing population? I think I'll leave that to the PCC. Heavily IntelliDex branding on this presentation. Please clarify, were we funding this or being paid? We'll clarify. We're certainly not funding it. We are obviously the external consultants, very much the independent consultants, so the PCC doesn't need to take our advice at all. I mean, but this is just a consultation process. In this, yeah, so we're independent consultants appointed by the PCC. The few international government alliance programs that aim to invest in the space of Africa financially. Yes. So, I mean, I think, we all know there's a myriad of different international programs. And I think, at some point, we also need to think about how do we coordinate all the different pieces of the puzzle and all the different initiatives that are taking place at the moment. I think that that's sort of where our advice comes in terms of a centralizing mechanism, clearly under the support of the PCC, who is, I think, playing a very important role in terms of overall coordination. But I think that's what the question's dealing with, and I would agree. Will the JTFM focus on the? I think we'll leave that for the tagging framework, Celia, and also the second one also on the tagging framework, because we do deal with that in a little bit of detail there. So any other questions from the room, perhaps?
We have a hand online from St. Apple.
Oh, yes, here we go.
Yeah, before that, I think the first query I should handle. This work, for complete transparency, is grant funded by the African Climate Foundation, which in turn is a re-grantor. And together with the ACF, the PCC forms part of the steering committee of this project. And therefore, while we steer the project, we do want the service provider who went through a proper selection process, that being a consortium of IntelliDex, Meridian, and RMB. So I'll deal with the branding question on future publications going forward, but I thought we should just clarify that while there's a degree of independence that the project team has, its perspectives and recommendations will be fed firstly into stakeholder engagements like this one, and then into the governance processes of the PCC. So how they finally emerge and whether they emerge as a set of PCC recommendations, time will tell. As I mentioned much earlier in my opening remarks, there are quite a few institutions and groups who are involved in looking at the just transition financing issues in the broader ecosystem. And as the PCC, we intend to look at all of those as well and decide as the PCC how to harmonize and, where necessary, integrate or choose from amongst them.
Thank you. I see there's a hand from St. Apperton.
Yes, sir. Thank you for the opportunity. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Yes, now we're coming from cooperatives. It's the Food Energy Water Tertiary Cooperative of South Africa. So as cooperatives, I think we represent the masses of our communities, whether provincially and nationally. And we would like to know as to how the JTFM is going to work with cooperatives, because we haven't heard anything about cooperatives. We have heard about SMMEs. And as we know, cooperatives as well can access a grant, you know, from the DTI. There is a grant that cooperatives can access and as well put it into the blended finances that are being planned. So kindly, we would like to know as to how we can, how cooperatives can be incorporated in all of this, because now we are as well into the circular economy, whereby we're seeing a waste into biofuels and the likes. So if the JTFM can come back to us and to see as to how you and us can work together, you know, in making sure that our communities or our members are not left behind as we are operating with large community members. I thank you.
Yes, thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, in my previous role, I was quite passionate about the role of cooperatives. I think particularly, like you say, a very important layer in terms of this particular, you know, just transition financing process. Community-based organizations are absolutely critical, and sort of as we envisage it, is that they will have access to the JTFM through the DBSA stakeholder engagement, and also I think an important point about project generation. So how do we ensure that cooperatives are able to access the JTFM? What are the ways we can assist cooperatives to access the JTFM? How will we set it up? Very much a core part of what we're trying to achieve, I think, with our advice about how it's set up.
Are there any hands or comments? Hands in the room at the back there, the gentleman in the glasses, and then Crispian, and then Joanne.
Good day, everyone. My name is Mzwandile Mene. I'm from the Northern Cape province, from Salpaki municipality. I actually came here because I found it important for me to attend this event to ensure that our voices are also heard. We do have a landlocked environment. The municipality is starting to have less land as years go by. So we are looking at support in terms of acquisition, because I don't know how far the process of the Section 25 is. Are you integrating such processes to ensure that local municipalities do have access to funding to acquire land, and to ensure that because our province, Kimberley was previously a mining town, and currently the diamonds have already depleted, and it's starting to turn into a ghost town. So we can also start to look at renewable energies, and also ensure that our landfill sites are also incorporated in ensuring that the Francis Baard district has a grid that will connect to the national grid to ensure that there's job creation, and also ensure that our local kings, because most of the other parts of lands are owned by co-op, like what we call these communal properties that were historically belonging to kings. And how can we ensure that we as a local municipality, we bring them together closer so that we can partner in generating renewable and alternative energies? Thank you very much.
Crispian.
Thank you, Chair, and morning, everyone. My name's Crispian Olver. I'm the Executive Director. So just a couple of points. I'd first of all like to just clarify the role of the Presidential Climate Commission in relation to this. So we're an advisory body. Ultimately, we make recommendations to the President, through him to Cabinet and to wider society. And, you know, I noted in your presentation, you made a number of references to the PCC playing a role in this mechanism. I actually don't think, I mean, you know, the PCC is not an executive body, nor would it be involved in any direct financing arrangements. What we will do as an outcome of this process and the consultations is make recommendations back to government on how we think such a mechanism could be designed and could work. And it'll ultimately be up to government as to whether they take those recommendations on board or not. So I hope that just clarifies it. I did want to make a comment which links up with Joanne's presentation earlier. So, you know, currently, it's not like we're starting from a completely blank slate. And there is, in fact, quite a substantial matchmaking process underway as we speak through the JET IP mechanism. I know it's very focused on a particular set of large infrastructure projects linked to the JET, although there are some important economic diversification and skills development initiatives within the JET IP package. And, you know, I see no mention of that made in the presentation, and it's almost as if the JET IP doesn't exist and we're now designing something completely from scratch. I think just certainly the way I understand it is that we've got the JET IP, it's playing certain roles and not others, and we're looking longer term at now how we design a process of matching funders and projects. And that brings me to my last point, which is a tension I see in the presentation. And, you know, at times the emphasis is on matchmaking and filling this information asymmetry gap that you, I think, speak to very eloquently. And I think there's clearly a need for such a facility going forward. But at times you use the language of direct financing. So, you know, lending finance, actually financing projects. And I guess of the points I'm making, this is the question. I mean, where on that spectrum are you seeing this sitting? Because listening to the case you've made, I think the matchmaking case is very clear. I'm not convinced about the argument around a single centralized finance blending facility, but maybe I've misunderstood the argument. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Crispian. Joanne?
Thank you, Deepak, and thank you. I think that Crispian clarified my one question, which was really around the role of the PCC. And my second point is about the investment plan and the fact that it is clear, I mean, there is quite a large grant package in that investment plan, a large part of which has been allocated, but still some fairly significant funding that hasn't. And we've also been kind of, I think there would be consensus that there needs to be some kind of a matchmaking clearinghouse mechanism that is set up in order to ensure that finance is flowing appropriately and information is flowing appropriately. Having said that, the one thing that I didn't hear is around the issue of facilitation. And I think that one of the challenges that we've identified is that if we are going to ensure that just funding flows to on-the-ground projects, to community projects, to projects, worker-based projects, there is going to have to be a huge amount of work done in order to support, build the capacity, help people to develop their projects to the point that they are fundable. And it is a priority area, because otherwise what happens is that the better resourced organizations, many of whom do fabulous work, I mean, there's not a question about the work, but they are urban based, or they're based in the big urban areas, and they are kind of, in a sense, the beneficiaries of the bulk of this funding, because we aren't providing the means that other initiatives can get access to the information, get themselves to a point where they can absorb those funds. And I think that we need to think very seriously about this issue of facilitation and support to on-the-ground communities, to a whole range of institutions. I mean, we've heard around the issue of cooperatives, in order to be able to spread benefit much more broadly, and for it to be seen that benefit is being spread. So I think that's the one issue. I think then, just a question. You seem to be, am I understanding right that you're saying the DBSA is the institution, or that you are proposing the DBSA as an institution? Because I think there's a conversation to be held there around, is it one institution? Is it a number of institutions? Where does one locate? Is it a kind of, I suppose, a much more decentralized or dispersed infrastructure that you're setting up, or a much more centralized one?
Thank you, Joanne. There was a gentleman there. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. If you could also introduce yourself.
No, thanks very much. My name is Landiwe Mahlangu. I'm actually coming here as the Joe Slovo Foundation, and let me say thanks very much for for this presentation. In a way, I think Joanne has actually just touched the point that I wanted to do, but just maybe to emphasize one aspect of it. I think for me as well was that the proposition of actually locating this within the DBSA as well, it's something that maybe would need to be clarified more. I say this because I was concerned that probably there's a risk of conflation and really makes accountability. I'm saying this because you would know, at least globally, that the volumes and the amount of private sector resources in this area still are far from what is expected. And I think the DFIs, at least international DFIs, in this regard has been really spotlighted as well, in the sense that there is also specific expectations in terms of how do they actually, if you like, adjust their financing model to actually address this issue in particular. Now DBSA is obviously inspired by these, DFIs. I'm raising the issue of accountability and conflation is to say is that we probably need to think about this very carefully to ensure that we don't make this initiative to be lost in all the kind of myriads of institutional arrangement and overlaid by all manner of dev speak, and such that we don't even know what needs to be achieved. So I'm saying that as we structure this, perhaps maybe the point has been made is to say it is convenient, yes, but probably I'm also biased in the sense that I used to be with DBSA before. I know what it can do and what it cannot do, and what it says it can do, and what is actually happening. So I think these are some of the things that I thought we might think around. Otherwise, it's a very good initiative, but let's just be careful in terms of how do we locate it in a way that we could ensure that it actually achieves what it intends to do. Thank you.
Thank you for that. A hand here. Hello, you had your hand up.
Morning. Thank you very much for the presentation. My name's Alia Kaji. I'm the public finance campaigner with 350 and the Fair Finance Coalition of Southern Africa. It's a mouthful. But before we get into details on the presentation itself, I actually just wanted to clarify the processes around commenting as well. This is the first event or public event that I know I've attended as a member of civil society on this mechanism itself. But I think we've gone into the details quite quickly as well. So I'm not sure what the timeframes might be on commenting just based off this presentation. And I just received the concept note yesterday. So I'm not sure if there are reports that you mentioned as well, particularly with the DBSA and DFFE relationship. So maybe some more information on how comments will be taken, received, integrated, and reported back on. And then maybe some more detail on things like the DBSA or DFIs in particular. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll take two more in the room. Is that enough for you to?
More than enough, yes.
The gentleman here, and then there was a hand at the back. I'll come back to you, Commissioner Mbodi.
Thank you very much. My name is Michael Manaka, and I come from the company Machoroma Oil Specialist. What I came here for is that I have been writing a lot of letters to the presidency, to the department DFFE, and then to the energy, DMRE, and also to the department of Mr. Ibrahim Patel. So it's a pleasure for me to have been invited also to to you, to the PCC, so that I can have an input. So what I came here for is to give the solution, so that about the just energy transition. So I think I did quite some information about why this climate change and how to solve it, because we have got a lot of problems around the globe: the fires, the drought, the floodings, the diseases. But I found it really helpful if I can come and give my input. And I have heard that there are people around here that are looking for solutions. So mine was to come to the presidency climate commission so that I can give the solution. I thank you, and I think this is the right place to have come, because all of us are in need of solutions. So I think also on the other side is that I do have a plan that can even now help with the load shedding, because that is one thing that is giving problems to our country. And then, yes, I think that is why I'm here. I've got a small company, but it's not really in its working. But I do have a plant, a machine that I have built that can really do much better in solving the current load sheddings and energy crisis in our country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to point you in the direction of our colleague Blessing Manali. Hand up there. Up, hand. Who will with pleasure receive your plan and your proposal, and we will make sure that it gets to the places where it can be considered properly. Thank you very much. At the back there, in the hat.
Thank you very much, Chairperson of the session, and salutation to the House at large. My name is Freedom Kuna. My question is based on capacity building and accessibility of JET funding, particularly to the women and the youth. My question is, what mechanisms, prima facie, do you have for women and young people in particular? Are there any mentorship programs that will ensure that young people and women are the beneficiary and are the forefront of just transformation? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just want to maybe respond in part to what Crispian has said and indicate, as well as someone else asked, what is the process through which this is going to be taken. This is not even midway in the project, and we've given the project team fair amount of latitude to consider what the ecosystem, the universe, as well as what the global response is to difficult to fund just transition projects. In terms of process, this is one of, I hope, many consultations that we will be having. These presentations that are being done here today, we would like in-person responses from the floor or online. I can also say that this is going for consideration to the working group, the climate finance working group of the PCC next week. That is still within the processes of the PCC rather than being spoken about as a PCC document or recommendation. After the working group has considered both the presentation as well as the reports, we will then put the work stream 1 and 2 reports onto the PCC website. We haven't thought through yet what the timeframes would be, but I can give you an assurance that once we publish it to the website as interim or draft reports, we will then welcome comments written, hopefully. But we will have stakeholder engagement checks during the course of this, and there might be a final report that the project team produces, which might be towards the end of September or early October, but that still hasn't yet. That still does not mean that the PCC has adopted these reports as PCC recommendations. Joanne, I think to your comment as well as Crispian's comment with respect to things that are afoot already, I made a very direct note of that as Roy went through his presentation, and need to say that the reality is that the just transition has started. It is unfolding, and there are elements of financing which are available. Some will come, and I don't think this project is intending to hamstring that process, nor is this project intending to be a latecomer to the ball, so to speak. What we are intending to do is identify where the blockages are. The project will make recommendations about institutional arrangements, which leads me to my final comment before I hand over to Roy. The DBSA has not been canvassed in any official kind of way in this process. And so if there are DBSA colleagues in attendance here or online, they themselves might be surprised at the directional way in which the project team is proposing the possible institutional location. And so I need to make the point that it will be a fit for purpose and executing agency and capacity that needs, in the short term at least, wherever the final mechanism might be housed in whatever form in the long term, that the PCC will consider and make recommendations with respect to where we think eventually the mechanism needs to be housed, or what what the nature of that mechanism is. Roy, I'll hand over to you, and then we can take more questions after that. Oh, Commissioner Mbodi, I see you waving frantically. I'll give you the floor.
Yeah, no, I thought you had recognized me. Look, I think something very important that we should always remember is whenever we deal with just transition, we don't deal with it abstractly. We deal with it in consideration, full consideration to the just transition framework. And I think whatever it is that we are trying to do should tie back to that. And that's why I like what Joanne just indicated of the work that should be done to make sure that we've got a very transparent but very equitable share of whatever is the finance that comes from this, the projects and whatnot. So I want to suggest the following. I want to suggest that one, we must make sure that at least we also look at your socially owned renewable sector category so that it doesn't look like we include them in talk, but we don't include them where the money is. If it were that there will be training that should be done in order to make sure, also looking at making sure that projects are bankable, if I use that term, let it be so that at the end, we do not close them out simply because what we know, they don't know. And I'm just suggesting this because if we do not look at the just transition framework for what it is in directing us here, we will end up only empowering the empowered, and that will not be just transition at all. I think that is another thing that, and also we mustn't leave out the fact that there are possible worker cooperations that will increase. Remember, part of the reason why there is even a PCC is so to make sure that we also create employment and find that inclusivity in finance leads to that direction. So I'm suggesting that maybe we don't even rush in such a way that it becomes clouded with the lack of transparency, and also clouded by the fact that it would seem like we are trying to empower the empowered. I think we need to be very careful around money, even to the point where you are suggesting that this is where the money should be and this is how it should be dispensed. All that should be more transparent. In fact, we need to spend a lot of time trying to demonstrate the transparency that ties back to the just transition framework. Otherwise, we are going to be blamed, all of us, for including people in paperwork, but where there is money, we exclude them practically. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Mbodi. Without taking the wind, I'll come back to you. I want to hand over to Roy before we take the next round of comments or questions. In the next session, you will see when Cecilia presents the assessment mechanism. I know this sounds very abstract, institutional, located in the ether, perhaps, but when we come to how we assess projects for want of a better word, to be assessed in terms of how they score against just transition outcomes, Cecilia will take us through, I hope, what will be a much more practically oriented assessment mechanism. I'm going to hand over to Roy before we take the next set of questions.
Right. Thank you very much, Deepak, and thank you for a very interesting set of questions. I think certainly the project has been very interesting. We've grappled with many of these things along the way, so we really appreciate it. I think the first question was related from Zindile about local communities and renewable energy, and I think absolutely critical part of the project, and also to understand how we convert sort of international financing to actually local level communities, to make sure it doesn't become, a highly theoretical thing, but we actually get to some practical allocation mechanisms. And that's where you need an institution that has experience in practically implementing on the ground, engaging with local communities. One of the things we've been thinking about, and this is one of the things that's come up already from our initial consultations, but something for us also discussed with the PCC, is to what extent can the mechanism engage with other community or other institutions that are better placed to deal with communities themselves. So, for example, there has been talk about to what extent can the JTFM or this matchmaking mechanism sort of work with, for example, provincial economic development departments, or with provincial governments, or with municipal economic development departments, or with municipalities. You know, it's not like it has to go directly to the project. It could actually work through other frameworks. So, you know, or with specialist entities at provincial level that are set up for this. You know, and then I think that goes to one of the later questions about the risks of over-centralizing things. You don't want to completely over-centralize, I think. And then to Crispin's point, yes, I mean, sorry, I should have made that a lot clearer in the presentation. The report goes into a lot of detail about this question, and, you know, obviously completely correct that the PCC's legal framework, you know, provides it as an advisory role. We're certainly not recommending that the PCC become involved in the day-to-day operations. And I think the points are very well made about how the PCC will interact with it. And I think also, I mean, we have had a representation from the JET IP PMU on the SteerCo, and I think a lot of those issues have come out, and I would certainly look at, and I think there was a point also made that this is not the central body. There will still also be other matchmaking happening. You know, there have been quite a lot of successes, and people, you know, are matchmaking. You know, I was telling my colleagues that talk about these matchmaking platforms that when I was young, we didn't do it that way. We just met people. There is a lot of matchmaking that takes place outside of the mechanism. There's no suggestion that this become sort of some kind of prescribed, this is the only way approach. And, you know, I think we should let as many different processes happen as possible, but you do need some institutional form that can sort of play a role in terms of many of the functions around the matching. And that I think goes to, yeah, I think that goes question also asked by Joanne, certainly not suggesting one institution, but rather many. And I think we will sort of clarify, perhaps that's something we should engage with in the recommendations with the PCC, is exactly the role of the PCC in the context of the JTFM. We've had some thinking about how we frame the ecosystem of the mechanism, I think. Then I think I've dealt with many of Joanne's questions. Particularly on the investment plan and the finance, and the fact that there is money available in the system, that the Treasury has made allocations to ensure that actually these are utilized and put in as part of the process. I think that's a very good point. Then on the accountability point, which I think is very well made, I agree with you. I think that's one of the lessons that appears to have been learned over time. There have been a lot of assessment reports about accountability frameworks between the DFFE and the DBSA, for example, making sure that it's very clear about how these funds are utilized and how they're used. Make sure that you do everything within the framework of the PFMA to make sure that you have adequate reporting, and that the Auditor General is happy, and that you have proper systems and processes to ensure that you know, there's no leakage of money. And how do you build something that we can ensure has got the highest levels of governance and accountability, which I think is very important. So I think a very good point, and I think we can strengthen some of our thinking around that. I think Deepak has spoken to the process, which is that we're about halfway. We're taking inputs with the PCC. We meet with them quite regularly to get feedback. We have the SteerCo, but this is our sort of opportunity to engage with civil society as broadly as possible. We're happy to have individual meetings with different members of civil society. We have a whole work stream set up for that. And yeah, I think we really would welcome as much engagement with civil society as possible as part of this process, because I think this is really the idea of the project, is it is a very highly consultative process. So I would agree with that. Then read my handwriting. Been told to wrap up. So capacity building. Oh yes, I'm very pleased to say on the role of young people, particularly women, that I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to ask one of the young women on my team to talk about that. So don't ask me. We'll have it. I think that'll be covered quite extensively in the tagging.
Thank you, Roy. With that, I want to make a suggestion that we move on to Cecilia's presentation of the assessment mechanism. I think a lot of the questions will get covered in the way in which she articulates and presents what is really a very practical methodology to look at just transition financing projects. So I'm going to hand over to Cecilia now, if that's okay with you, Cecilia. And Roy, the questions and comments in the chat, if I can ask you to respond to them in the chat.
That's a good idea.
Thank you.
Hey, hi everyone. As Deepak said, I'm Cecilia, and I will be discussing the tagging mechanism or tagging framework with you. You can go to the first slide. Sorry. Oh. Just help me quickly. Okay, so the tagging framework is will function as an assessment tool for just transition projects. The main aim of the tagging framework and what we hope it addresses is expanding the current narrow scope of the just transition discourse, which is only focused on climate change efforts. So we hope that by recognizing the more comprehensive elements of what a just transition is as embodied in the just transition framework, that the tagging mechanism plays a valuable role in expanding the scope beyond climate change. This has come up quite a lot. It does share similarities with the green finance taxonomy in that it sets the minimum standards for what can be considered just transition projects. And it also aims to reduce uncertainty about just transition projects. So for instance, during one consultation engagement with a DFI, a concern was raised that some funders are worried about just washing. So we hope that the tagging framework would also address that. But it differs from the green finance taxonomy in that, firstly, in terms of scope, so it doesn't only assess climate change efforts or climate-related impact, but also the crucial social justice aspects. And we framed it in such a way, or we designed it in such a way to include, especially in the initial phase of the just transition, as Deepak said, it hasn't necessarily started yet. So with the tagging framework, we want to include as many more projects rather than exclude. So we designed it to be less prescriptive than what a taxonomy approach could possibly be. So next time. Okay. Sorry. Just wanted to before this comes up. So the tagging, if a project gets tagged, it doesn't necessarily mean that it will get access to the JTFM. The tagging framework doesn't assess for any financial aspects of a project. It merely assesses the just transition aspect. So it doesn't determine bankability or access to the JTFM. So as I said, some projects will get tagged, but not necessarily have access to what the JTFM will eventually do. And that would be a decision for the JTFM governance body. So here, criteria could entail, for instance, the availability of funds, the scale of the project, and other assessment criteria. But if it doesn't get access to the JTFM, we hope that the tag will, and we assume that there's a lot of work going into that, of course, but we hope that the tag will be valuable in itself as well. For instance, we looked at a lot of potentially just transition projects, and the majority of them are quite small. They aren't necessarily large-scale projects, and these sorts of projects typically struggle to get financing. So we hope that the tag will enable project sponsors to maybe go to a bank or access funding through other channels with the assurance that it is indeed a just transition project. Okay, so this is the framework we use to it's a dual lens to conceptualize what kind of activities will need assistance amid the just transition. And these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, but we hope and we think, and in our experience, it allows for a targeted support. So we divide the just transition movement into transitioning out and transitioning in. So transitioning out basically deals with the targeted support required for communities and workers that are at risk of livelihood shocks or job losses. So these are typically also geographical interventions. So here, these sorts of contexts would require targeted initiatives and efforts. While the transitioning in, here, the just transition manifests, the just transition manifests in how targeted support is given to a community or workers to enable them to benefit from the low carbon economy. So a majority of projects that we looked at have elements of both, but we also think that by categorizing just transition projects into this framework, we can also track to see where support is needed. So we have looked at the current landscape of just transition projects, and there's quite a lot of transitioning in projects. So we can assess and monitor using this lens to determine where support for the just transition might be needed. So our tagging framework is divided into 4 or mainly 3 categories. So the first one is the climate impact category, which I'll talk about later. So we'll go into each of the categories. Then the transitioning in and out and the EDSD. So, and then based on our focus group discussions, we've included additional bonus points for gender and youth, if gender and youth is prioritized, not just gender inequality and youth unemployment and involvement. So before I delve into the, okay, let's quickly just on methodology. Is there any way we could maybe move the toolbar so that it's not at the top? Yeah. Okay, so the methodological approach we used. So we drew on the Just Transition criteria from the Impact Investing Institute, also from our literature review of just transition mechanisms across the globe. Locally, of course, the Just Transition framework, that maybe, yeah, that's the core framework that informed our tagging approach. But we also looked, as I mentioned, at the existing landscape of just transition projects. What we wanted to do, what this approach helped us with, is to sort of ground the theoretical frameworks in the local realities of projects. So this means that potentially the tagging framework can be amended as the landscape develops, as funders, both funders and project sponsors, amend or mold their projects more aligned with the JTF. So then we can maybe have a more granular criteria and perhaps consider including the green finance taxonomy for the climate impact. But for now, we wanted to include, as I mentioned, more projects and give more projects access than exclude. And the case studies also informed many of the dimensions that we looked at. The entire framework isn't based on existing projects, but it's we hope that it's a nice middle point between the frameworks and the local reality. Okay. Oh, okay. Before I delve into the dimensions of the tagging framework, I just wanted to highlight the feedback we received from the focus group discussion and our responses before we delve into each in more detail. So one of the concerns were that we should better align the JTF principles in the tagging, and we amended or adjusted some wording and included 2 categories or 2 dimensions, the environmental restoration and the M&E and transparency. But how do I get that? So, we took out the governance criteria. So one of the concerns were that if a project scores highly in the other dimensions, then it could pass and get tagged even though it has poor governance frameworks. So this the governance aspects should be assessed separately. Just going back to this one, the accountability and M&E transparency here is designed to assess the extent to which the project recognizes procedural justice and ensures that procedural justice underpins the initiatives. If you just look at some of the other comments, so as I mentioned, we incorporated additional points for gender and youth. There was also a comment that we shouldn't focus on adaptation, but because these projects are so hard to finance, that would only focus on mitigation. Our criteria is set up that you need a very low, the threshold's very low for the climate impact. And we do think that in line with the Just Transition Framework, that adaptation should definitely be represented. And I saw this is also a question online asking if we will focus on green hydrogen or renewable energy. So the tagging framework is set up to be sector agnostic. So initially we were maybe a bit energy focused because the current landscape of projects are mostly renewable energy projects, but we have changed that to include more. Should I speed up? Okay. So this is the preliminary screening. So all projects need to pass this phase to be considered further. The reason for this is that we need some differentiation between social development projects and just transition projects. And just transition projects do and should have an environmental or climate dimension. The transitioning in criteria, so we score for job creation in the low carbon economy, how the project supports the development of low carbon economic activities, climate resilience, and if the transitioning in project takes place in a targeted geography, it gets extra 5 points. The transitioning out, so this is the support given to geographies that are and communities that are at risk or are being displaced as a result of decarbonization. So economic diversification, job place for community transition, support, infrastructure investment, and improving access to basic needs like food, water, education, and okay, go on. This is the EDSD criteria. So this is where we look at equity and inclusion, the sort of composition of the framework of the project. So to what extent does it involve community participation, affordability? Will the project's benefits be affordable to everyone? So, as I mentioned here, and then with SMME and local content, prioritization of local content. So it's much more in detail in the report, as I hope you'll see. And then the additional bonus points for gender and youth. So are there measures to address gender inequality and youth unemployment? Okay, so the threshold. So the climate impact category has a total points of 15, and you only need, a project only needs 3 out of 15. So the thresholds are deliberately low because, as I mentioned, we want to include more projects, but also the projects that we looked at are quite small. So they wouldn't necessarily cover all the criteria in the framework. And then transitioning in or out. So it needs to, a project would have to reach the threshold for either of these categories, not both. And then EDSD. which is 12 out of 25. And these are some of the projects we looked at. So we just wanted to illustrate that a mobile learning lab, even though it might be a social justice project, it's not a just transition project because there's no climate element. The Komati training facility. So this is an important point. So there's not necessarily a direct climate impact with the Komati training facility, but it does target areas in Mpumalanga where the community will be facing job losses. So there's a climate impact as a result of broader decarbonization efforts. So these projects, reskilling projects, would definitely be included. And I think then I'm done.
Cecilia, thank you. That was a mouthful. If you can give the pointer to me, I hope I can work this. I'd like to keep some of the slides on, please. We reload the slides, please. Go back. Okay, I've got control. It's fine, I think. Okay, we're going to open up for discussion and conversation. I know that was a mouthful. I don't expect people to remember the quantum of points given, but I would like to focus the discussion on the fundamental content of the issues we are looking at to work out whether they are the right tags to be utilized to judge whether a project is just transition finance or not. So to quickly recap, transitioning in means there's an opportunity for livelihood creation, social ownership, and new economic let's just call them new local economic value chains and supply chains into which people can begin to explore ways in which to improve their economic lives. Transitioning out, next slide, please. Transitioning out is where there might be negative impacts as a result of the just energy or other transitions that take place. And here we're looking at ways in which to ensure that people who are negatively impacted are covered in the determination of whether support and projects are just transition or not. I'm not going to go into the more detailed numerical indices, but it will be very useful online as well as in the audience to get some comments and feedback about whether this is fundamentally a good or not good approach to determining whether a project is just transition finance qualifying or not. So I'm going to open up the floor. I've got Lebogang, then I've got a hand here in the front of the room. Lebo.
Thanks, Deepak, and thanks to the presenter. I think this is a good place to start, and I think a way to build up on how we understand just transition financing. So, I mean, I'm looking at the transitioning in criteria, and I know that, you know, climate would be like an important criteria for some of these projects, but I'd like us to think a bit broader than that. So, for example, you'll have a project that has very little to do with climate, but because you support that particular project, it has an important linkage to the actual just transition. I think when we looked at the Komati experience, some of what the community articulates as just transition has very little to do with climate. The availability of ECD facilities, clinics, these things have very little to do with the actual climate question. But if we do these little things, they link us very well in terms of the actual just transition component. So there may be a need to categorize your transitioning in components and criteria, where some do look at climate and then some don't, but there are important linkages for us to get to the just transition, which I think is an important thing to look at. Now we're saying that we're trying to avoid justice washing of of certain projects, and I want to understand how that happens in the context of, you know, at the end of the day, for you to finance something, you do want a return on investment, and that's usually a key consideration for most of your financing decisions. And I'm very afraid that you're going to end up with a lot of projects that do exactly that justice wash. So how do we get over the whole justice washing of projects if, you know, return on investments and quick return on investments are key consideration for financing decisions. Now, I also looked at the other components of, you know, your tagging requirements. I think there was some mention of skills transfer, but I think we're going to have to go broadly into who the skills transfer is going to. And I think there was an attempt to talk about women and youths, and I think that's going to be important. I think one of the things that's lacking for me, or I didn't see it, is just the question around tagging requirements also being linked to localization. Because I think that's the downstream opportunity for job creation that I didn't see in the presentation. It may be in the actual broader document, but I just didn't see it in this presentation. And I think these are probably some things to look at in a bit more detail. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Lebogang. Alia?
Thanks very much. I'm glad I'm going after Lebogang, because I think some of the questions are related in the sense that I think I'm still stuck on the first presentation from Roy, where I think conceptually we're still trying to talk about how to redirect financing towards outcomes that are social and just, where financing does seek that return in investment. And I'm just interested in, I think, the methodology which we're trying to comment on here. So I'm trying to keep my comments specific to that. And so I think in developing these criteria and a lot of the topics that have been mentioned already, I think even I saw somewhere on the chat that, you know, Intellidex branding is all over. Like, I think the Intellidex consulting group is also very well versed in financial markets and technicalities of financial markets. But in terms of developing the criteria, I would be very interested in, you know, how we govern and regulate financial markets for the just and social outcomes that we want to see in the just transition, not just necessarily mobilizing it and tracking it. And so when we're looking at things like addressing the market failures, how do we successfully address market failures by also trying to encourage and mobilize the market, whilst trying to encourage just and social outcomes, which the market does not do? I think environmental and social challenges are then technically termed as market externalities anyway. So I think just in terms of the conceptual framing of how we're mobilizing the market will be maybe something that's in the report. Again, I'm not sure this is what I've seen so far, but I think that still needs to be really interrogated as the basis of these criteria. And so looking at the criteria themselves, if we look at the methodologies in developing them, I would be very cautious in looking at international, I think you said impact investing criteria. I'm not sure if those are based on international investment standards, if they're based on guidance, if they're based on principles, which a lot of them would be voluntary. So I don't know how we then apply that to something that it would be mandatory or obligatory in terms of how we seek and grant financing. A lot of those standards are best practice, which is definitely not the case for a lot of projects on the ground. And so in terms of, like I said, managing and regulating and governing a lot of these processes, I would be, again, very keen to look at the governance processes that were touched on, particularly in terms of like the stakeholders. And so I would be interested in something or a group or an organization like the DBSA that is something that is designed to address market failures and how they govern those. But again, I think complexity of mobilizing private capital, even philanthropic capital, whilst maintaining social outcomes. So again, how that translates to the criteria, and where I think we could have seen a lot more in terms of local in what exists already, like not necessarily the JTF, which I agree is completely necessary, but those are also principles. But there is a lot of underlying policies or planning or strategies, at least in the South African context, like the NDP, or the work that I think that's been done by the Planning Commission and the MPC, for example. So I know from civil society perspective, there's a lot to be said and a lot that's been done on, you know, the human rights challenges or abuses or gender inequality that already exists in our public budget. I think a lot of those existing pieces of work could definitely have translated in terms of the criteria, rather than perhaps a top-down exercise of what exists internationally and what exists for standards for a very new sector, like you said. But what's not new are the triple challenges of inequality, unemployment, and poverty, which work and content has been developed on that I think could better translate here, particularly in terms of measurement. And so I think the next thing that we see is also the transparency in terms of in terms of M&E. But I think even before the M&E of the projects themselves, and I see you've taken out the governance of projects themselves, but the actual transparency of allocation, even before that, an assessment, like who's assessing, who's taking the criteria, who's measuring the criteria. And again, I've talked about, I think, the challenges and weaknesses within the criteria themselves, not even looking at the topics. Like I said, I haven't had enough time to look at them, but in terms of assessing them. And so even in the stakeholders mentioned, I think there was government, there was PCC, there was private sector and civil society. I think labor wasn't in there either. If you're looking, I'm not sure how projects were tested. Projects were selected for stress testing as well. Some of them, I think, may be case in point for what could be challenging with these criteria. I know there's the Komati training facility mentioned, but there have been huge issues with the decommissioning of Komati, and let's say the availability of information to workers themselves and community members themselves. So how has that been taken account in that stress test, where again we're looking at the existing context of communities and areas that I don't necessarily think top-down criteria of international voluntary principles or standards or very new projects will be applicable in the context here. So yeah, I think I'm going to stop there.
Thank you very much for that very elaborate exposition of issues. I think the project team is diligently taking notes, and we will very sincerely incorporate those comments. There's a hand at that table.
Thanks. Mine is a short question. Maybe I've missed something, or maybe it's coming later, but I'm struggling to see, Roy, when you started, you're talking about matching, and I'm struggling to see that side of the coin. So there's the tagging and the criteria that's put in place. Some people have mentioned the financial criteria, but I struggle to see how, if I was sitting on the other side, how the matching would happen, because presumably the person on the other side is also looking for certain criteria. And I don't know if on their side, as they evaluate, are they going through a similar process? Because for the matching to happen, you'd almost, I don't know, either going through the same process or maybe using the same methodology. I'm also struggling to see how, and I don't know if this is coming later, the market failures that were mentioned, especially around information asymmetries and actually maybe the information one, that is kind of, I can see, and the diverse investment horizons. I don't see that coming through here as well. Again, thinking if I was on the other side looking to finance this, how would I know? How would I see this? And then I think the last part, still again, assuming I was on the other side, my understanding is that there'll be different financing structures. Some might be blended, some might be direct. So in addition to the things you've discussed, I see also an issue around the scale of the projects. And I don't know if this is here, but I don't see how the methodology, like, is it applicable across the different financial instruments that you're looking to target? That's the question, just the other side of the coin.
Thank you for that. I just want to also say to Roy and Cecilia, you need not respond in a sort of defensive way. If you had to simply say that's a good point and we'll incorporate it into our project thinking, that's also sufficient. So this is not a tribunal. I'm just anticipating that I can see the hackles raising there. This is not a sort of, it's not an inquisition. Christelle, do I see your hand up? No? Anyone else? Could I ask Roy online, because you are online, to just make note of some of the chats? Desigan?
Thank you, Deepak. And I don't want to take you back, but there was something in this part of the presentation that was clearer around what the scope is of this facility. One, the expansion of the scope beyond energy into low carbon is, of course, strongly supported. The exclusion of adaptation presents a challenge. Unless there's another mechanism that is being looked at in the discussion around how you deal with adaptation. I mean, there are large draw factors around some of the projects in the adaptation space. You will know them: seawalls, reorganizing water infrastructure, climate smart agriculture beyond energy use, new cultivars, all of that. So it would be useful to know how the team is thinking about where this is included and how. And secondly, just to pop another case study to look at that might be closer to the model that you're talking about, and that's the Water Partnership Office in the DBSA. Because there seems to be closer parallels between that compared, for example, with the Green Climate Facility. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for that. I'll ask Cecilia to handle your feeling that adaptation is missing. Online, Roy? We have hands online. Oh, Kobisa?
Great. Am I audible?
Yes.
Hi. All right. Thank you so much, and thanks for the opportunity. Look, my one issue, really, I would be really keen to see the conceptual framework that Intellidex has used to really frame this taking framework. I think we are most keen as the National Treasury really to see the theoretical background and the understanding and the literature that was reviewed in informing this exercise, for one. On another hand, we are also quite keen to see where we could actually align with some of the work that we've done as the Treasury, whether looking from a green taxonomy point of view or the framework that you're developing when it comes to the climate tagging as well. The other issue, and I think that was raised by the previous speaker as well, is just the logical or the wisdom behind the exclusion of adaptation. I think for me, in my not so expanded understanding on these issues, I would think issues of just transition would in fact actually speak best to issues around adaptation than it would around issues of mitigation. So I just want to understand really the wisdom that informs the said exclusion of issues of adaptation, and if not part of this exercise, which would be then the appropriate exercise of framing such issues as well. Thank you so much, Deepak. Like I said, we are interested to see really the theoretical framework. If Roy and Tim can share those documents with us, please. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you very much. Next up is Polani. Polani Mabuza. Going once, twice. While we're waiting for Polani, under David.
Hi, thanks for giving the space. I'm Amanda David from the French Development Agency. I just had 4 questions. The first one, and I'm sorry because this might be a very naive question, but how does this work articulate with the track and tag of just transition projects that is being led by TIPS, which is also proposing a framework for tagging just transition projects? Then the second one is, it's more, of course, it's biased because we're a bilateral donor, but usually, and from what we understood from the Just Transition Framework, it's also about policy reform and enabling the whole policy process to be able to tackle these market failures that have been mentioned. And I don't see how this type of framework could actually include the policy support from donors. So for instance, if we're supporting a policy reform, how do you actually identify which are the actions or the specific policy levers that are or not in the just transition? And this is a bit linked to the third question, where I concur with Lohang's intervention about the social development projects. And I think that the PCC colleagues have also experienced this, because when we talk to communities about what is just transition, the issue of service delivery comes up in the top priorities. So it's, for me, it's very difficult to see how just transition could sort of leave aside completely the social development projects. And then my last question, on your additional points that projects would be getting, the bonus points, what is the sense of this? How do you plan on using these points? Would there, I mean, if a project gets a maximum number of points, why is this more important than, I would say, I know, being a highly concessional project as compared to a completely private one? Thank you.
Thank you. I hope Roy or Cecilia got those questions. No, hang on. I'm going to take two more, and then I'm going to ask between Roy and Cecilia to try and cover all the comments in the question. Kulani, are you back? I'm going to move on. There's a Saint Apeton Bosal. I'm sorry. Yes, thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Yes, no, as mentioned previously, few Co-op SA, we are coming from carbon denominated industries. That is your food, energy, water, South Africa tertiary cooperatives. And then here again, mostly the presentation that you are seeing, they are mostly speaking to SMMEs instead of cooperatives. And here now we are talking financing. And as we know, cooperatives, as opposed to SMMEs, they do have grants. And as well, with SMMEs are individualistic in nature, as opposed to cooperatives that are very inclusive. And so we would like really the PCC to look into cooperatives, and as well the presenters or people, the commissioners there within the PCC, they should be aware of cooperatives and the work of cooperatives in our communities, which are not individualistic. So if we can look into that, and as well, we must not forget that cooperatives as well, they are women-based and they are youth-based. It's not to say that cooperatives are mainly for males. So we do have female and as well as youth cooperatives in the secularity sector, as well as in the food production sector, as well as in the renewable energy spaces. So we would like the PCC to look into cooperatives going forward, because since we've been attending meetings of the PCC, we have never heard anyone speak to cooperatives. Hence, as well, we would like maybe to have a space whereby one of our directors can as well be part of commissioners there, so that cooperatives can be looked into. I think it was not a question, it's just a comment as to what is happening.
Thank you very much, Apeton. And that point is well noted. All forms of decentralized and widespread ownership need to be considered. Cooperatives, whether they be other forms of social ownership of assets or value chains. Point very well made and taken. Natalie?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the robust discussion. This is Natalie Mangondo from ICLEI Africa. I just wanted to highlight, the challenges that we've seen in climate project tagging and the fact that it involves subjective judgments, and that these criteria for evaluation may vary among different stakeholders. And so to inquire what you are doing to ensure that these criteria for evaluation allow to compare different projects across different contexts. And then I think the second area that hasn't really been mentioned is the kind of limited impact of, just transition project tagging on systemic issues, because as the donor funder mentioned, project tagging may not address the underlying systemic issues related to climate change and social inequality. And so while it may promote specific projects, it may not fully change the broader structures that perpetuate environmental degradation and economic disparities. So I'd love to hear from you what you're doing to mitigate these risk factors. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. I'm going to take the last two. Clement?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Am I audible?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, thanks for attending this nice JTE FM. Me, I would like to firstly, because this is true from the JET IP, because already the investment plan it's on hand, but now the mechanism it's hard to implement them for now, because already the monitoring and evaluation mechanism between the government and the social partners and all the civil society are very weak due to what? Due to the investment plan. Already people are still looking at the solution of electricity. It doesn't include the skill development. It also doesn't include the community to own their hydrogen stations, like the black taxi industry. They are using the quantums, but the government doesn't consult the black taxi industry, like my brother said here, the cooperatives, where the people, the grassroots, because this term of saying no one must be left behind. Each and every information must move with all the communities. It must not only focus on the business, because the most of the ETP and IP and FM priorities, it's national electricity, it's also the electric vehicles, and it's also again on the municipal investment needs, because people are living in the municipalities. Last on the meeting, and the Salga minister also highlighted it, because people have to get subsidies to be involved in this industry and to be involved in our just energy transition investments. But the mechanism can be really transparent, because already others are left behind, mostly the poor communities, even the disability community, because me, from the grassroots level, I'm presenting the disability sector, the people living with the disability. Already the high and the expensive electricity, if you are using the electric wheelchair, you don't have, you will be more, in the distress. But we don't consider that as we prepare, and we will come again and want to amend these things, but we have to start it from the fresh, as the framework said, because we have already implemented the just a transition framework. But when we're talking with investment, others are left behind, mostly our Black communities, and mostly the people who are vulnerable to this climate change, who now, like even like at Mercado, the heritage people who were living in the place is being destroyed without consulting the communities. But for me, it's my comment, we have to consider to consult first those people who are on the ground, because now each and every, even the load shedding, you find the load shedding is off in the township, but for the companies, they have to produce because it's all about money. But we are not here to point fingers. We have to come in with solutions. And also, my brother, I think that let's consider from the grass, from down to top. And then top, they will also adapt and also mitigate. Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks.
Thank you for those remarks, Clement. Well made and well taken. Some of them might be out of the scope of this JTFM project, but certainly the call for considering communities, people with disabilities, women, as well as youth in the just transition, absolutely taken as points that we need to incorporate in all of our work. I'm going to give Xolani the last chance to unmute and speak. Otherwise, I'm going to hand over to Roy. You have 5 minutes, Roy, to address all of the issues. And then I want to hand over to Crispian, who will make some, not closing remarks, but I think general remarks with respect to where to with this work in the context of the just transition. Roy, 5 minutes.
Celia is the one that knows what's going on in this particular section, so I might, hopefully we'll cover them. Otherwise, we have taken recordings. We've obviously keeping track of all the comments in the chat. We will incorporate all of these into the final report. So I mean, if we don't respond right now, don't worry. I just want to respond to the very, very good question, because this also came up in the consultation with the National Treasury, which is that the tagging framework may not necessarily match, if that's the correct term, but may not be aligned, there's a different word, to the, I would call it the investment guidelines or the what the funders are looking for. So we must be very careful about imposing a tagging framework which doesn't match what the supply side of funds is providing. Because then they're not going to use this framework. They're going to say, well, you know, and I think that's, you know, very well made from their perspective, is that, you know, they, for example, may want to see more transitioning in or more transitioning out, or some funders may want to see projects that are more gender sensitive or more youth oriented. And we must be very careful about saying that that's not allowed. So how we foresee it, and this will come up, and I think it's a very good point, and this is some of the things we're thinking about in terms of when we get to the governance framework, is that the tagging framework becomes a sort of an overall guideline for the governance structure to find, but doesn't become prescriptive. I hope that answers the question. And Kubisa's question around the theoretical background, yes, we had a lot of engagement with Sarah about particularly the taxonomy, and also then climate budgeting, tagging. I mean, we still actually want to follow up with you about that, because that has come up quite a lot in the conversations, is to make sure that that although this fulfills a different role to the taxonomy and to the budget tagging, it must be consistent with those things, so that we don't create multiple systems of particularly on the sustainable financing taxonomy and on the budget tagging framework. But there's a whole section in the report, and Cecilia can go into, she's done a lot of work on the alignment. I don't know if you want to say anything about it now, or we can follow up on it. Maybe we should have a follow-up meeting on it, because I think it's quite an important point. We don't want to create a framework that is outside of those other frameworks, at least if that makes sense. For obvious reasons. Otherwise, I mean, I worked on the sustainability, I worked on the taxonomy, and I often ask the team, how is this different from the taxonomy? Why is it different? So that's quite important. And then I think I've run about 5 minutes, but I will just 2 minutes. Okay. Sorry, the big one? Oh, adaptation. I knew a difficult question would be for Cecilia.
Thank you all for the comments. A lot of the financing stuff that you mentioned, the tagging framework doesn't necessarily address the financial aspects, but we can take that into account and maybe adapt it that way. The other comments, thank you all. We'll be in consultation with the PCC. Just on the adaptation question, I don't know, maybe I spoke too fast or I was a bit unclear. We definitely include adaptation, and we also aim to include adaptation throughout the framework. We have criteria for community resilience building, which includes sustainable agriculture and local food systems, and climate resilience, infrastructure, investments. So the adaptation is definitely included in the framework. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I just want to make the overarching comment that this has been a very rich conversation, and you've given us real food for thought, which as the project team, we will go away and take them into account. As we indicated, this project still has a bit of runway to ensure that all comments are incorporated, and that what emerges from this for the PCC to consider through its processes should be fit for purpose and useful as we look at ways in which to aggregate, deploy, structure, finance towards just transition finance projects and portfolios of projects. I'm going to bring this session to a close and ask Crispian to come up and make some observations as well as closing remarks, following which we will close the session. Those of you who are here physically are welcome to go to the restaurant for lunch thereafter. Crispian.
Okay, thank you, Deepak, and thank you everyone for your participation and joining us in the session. I'd like to echo what Deepak was saying. It's been an incredibly rich set of inputs and discussions. And also, thank you to the IntelliDex team for all the technical work they've been putting into this. So, I mean, maybe to go back to first principles in trying to summarize. I mean, what we're trying to do is address a gap in the market. And that gap, from the perspective of funders that are wanting to fund just transition projects, they describe the lack of a pipeline. And from the perspective of communities and cooperatives and SMMEs and project developers trying to get into the game, they describe the lack of funding or the misalignment. So the funding instruments that are available to them aren't fit for the projects that they want to do. Roy sort of summarized that at the beginning as an information asymmetry, because we do have a lot of people wanting to fund, and we do have a lot of projects looking for funding. So we're trying to bridge this asymmetry. And ultimately, what we want to do out of this process as the PCC is make recommendations about how to address the gap. And we want those recommendations to be relevant. So, you know, we're needing them to be grounded in all of your collective views. I mean, you're all involved in this ecosystem, you know, either on the funders or the developers side. or in terms of, broader roles as regulators, national treasury, etc. So, we've heard some, I think, very interesting proposals, and, basically what it centers on is a matchmaking platform, the objective of which is to reduce uncertainty, to signal alignment with the Just Transition framework, and to mobilize the finance into these projects. As we said, we're trying to connect funders looking for projects and project owners, broadly defined, which I would very explicitly want to include SMMEs that Zama spoke to so coherently earlier, cooperatives, socially owned renewable projects, etc. You heard some interesting proposals around institutional arrangements. And, I think the debate that we were having was, do we want a centralized mechanism versus a more diverse, decentralized mechanism with multiple different funders in it? And, I just want to assure you from the side of the PCC, this is not an issue that we've prejudged. So we're not punting the DBSA as a solution. It was put forward. I think it's a very useful proposal to stimulate discussion. But we've floated the proposal without even the DBSA having a chance to discuss it. So it's an example. And it might not be just one institution, it might be multiple institutions. And in reality, what we've got to do is sort of take a step back. So before we start debating institutions, I think what we want this process to be telling us very clearly, what are the functions we want performed? And then we can ask the question, who is best placed to perform those functions? So I want to assure the room that we're going to follow that discussion with you. We're not trying to pre-bake any kind of solution. And maybe to reiterate a point I was making earlier about the role of the Presidential Climate Commission. I mean, a couple of references have been made about the PCC being involved in this funding arrangement. That is not our job. Our job is simply to give advice and to make recommendations. So we will recommend ultimately, as an outcome of the process that we're following, how we think a just transition financing mechanism could work. When that mechanism is established, if and when by government, we will have no direct role in it. It's not our job. We're not trying to define a role for ourselves in this. Our role always will be to have an arm's length critical relationship with everything that's going on in the just transition space, so that, at the end of the day, we stand back, we critique, we give advice. You as stakeholders out there can take our advice or you can ignore it. We hope the advice we give is relevant and useful and takes things forward, but we're not trying to design a role for ourselves in any kind of financing mechanism. I just want to make that absolutely clear. In terms of the next steps, so, I mean, what we're aiming towards is to get a paper that we can put out for public consultation purposes. So there were some outputs produced in preparation for this workshop. We're going to be taking all of the inputs that we've heard and listened to, and we'll produce a consolidated easy to engage with single paper that integrates all of this, and we'll be putting it out. It'll be on our website. We'll put it out for public engagement, and we'll obviously all be able to have a second bite at the cherry as we engage with that paper and the recommendations it makes. And once we've taken all of those inputs on board, we'll, as the Commission, be finally ready to make recommendations, first to the President, through him to Cabinet, and, the practice we follow, also we make those recommendations public, and they're recommendations made to the broader society. So that's the step we intend to go through. So all it leaves me to do is to thank you for coming, to thank Deepak for facilitating, to thank all of the technical work, to thank Commissioner Zama for the inputs she made, and to invite you to join us for lunch. Thanks.